For many years, the SNP have had a convention that we didn't intervene in English legislation. There have been some exceptions to that, of course. For example, we voted against foundation hospitals because we thought that would bring about the fragmentation of the English health service. That's what's happened, of course. We voted against tuition fees being imposed on English students in England because we believe that once that happened, there would be a move to impose them on Scottish students in Scotland, which is, of course, what happened. So there have been exceptions to that convention.
But would you vote on education and NHS legislation for England if you were in a deal? Because that's what Labour would be looking for, wouldn't it? But they have to get their legislation through if they want to rule.
One of the things that I learned in that experience of minority government in Scotland, when I had to negotiate with all of the other parties to get budgets through and things, one of the things I learned was it's probably wise, if you're in that position of an opposition party, not to reveal too many of your cards in advance. The people who played their cards best were the ones who didn't play them face up.
But would you vote, for example, to pass a Labour budget?
Well, that would depend on the circumstances and what Scotland could gain from the process. It would depend on the circumstances whether, although I think it's unlikely we were in a coalition with Labour Party, it would depend if there was a confidence and supply agreement. It would depend if we were
Which is more likely.
It would depend if we were voting case by case on individual votes. Each of these votes, if that was the perspective, would be an opportunity to make progressive gains for Scotland.
There is talk, and it is only talk, that the Sinn Fein is watching very carefully what happens to the Scottish National Party. And although it's declared...
I'm sure lots of people are watching very carefully.
Though they've said they would never take their seats in Westminster, that there is some talk that they might change that if they thought it was going to be advantageous.
Well, look, I've no insight into the tactics of Sinn Fein, or for that matter, the Democratic Unionist Party. But I would be very surprised if people weren't looking at this kaleidoscope potential of a parliament and not seeing how legitimate political ambitions can be pursued. Incidentally, this is entirely proper. This is what politics is about. That's why people vote. And I'm saying for the first time in many years, people in Scotland can vote with the reasonable expectation that we might actually have a decisive influence in legislation in the next Parliament, and that is all to the good. Nothing improper or wrong about that.
So you could work with Sinn Fein, you could work with the DUP?
We would work with people who pursue objectives. That doesn't mean we agree with the range of their policies, but if there are policies in common, of course we could work.
What is the position then when it comes to Smith Commission Plus, or whatever it is? Is it about raising more taxes in Scotland that are not going to then be returned to the Treasury? What is the red line on that?
Well, our objective is following through what is Home Rule, Devo Max, near federalism. Would be for Scotland to raise all of its own finance and then to remit to the Treasury for common services, defence, foreign affairs, things that are still run by the Westminster Parliament. That would be the most effective way to deliver Devo Max, near federalism or Home Rule. That's what Home Rule means in its proper sense. So that would be our objective, and how far we get towards that objective will depend on the parliamentary strength and the parliamentary situation there is in the next Westminster Parliament. But I think the chances are we could get a long way towards that objective.
Just one last question. Do you regret that saltire waving at Wimbledon?
Not in the slightest, but I did actually say that when the Spectator were courageous enough to award me Politician of the Year, I had a St George's Cross to dab the tear from my eye as I accepted the award, and I gave an absolute assurance that if the All England club, despite my new lowly position, invite me back to the centre court, and if Andy wins again, as I'm absolutely sure he'll do, I shall wave the saltire and the St George's Cross in the centre court at Wimbledon, because after all we all know that Andy's really British, at least when he's winning.